A stranger at Christmas. Agnes Miller adjusted the warm scarf around her neck as she stepped out of her small, cozy car, her arms filled with grocery bags. She took in a deep breath of the chilly December air, savoring the scent of pine from the neighborhood's decorated trees. Christmas lights adorned the houses along her suburban street, casting a festive glow over the fresh blanket of snow. Despite the cheer surrounding her, Agnes felt a familiar pang of loneliness tug at her heart. She had hoped to hear from her children about visiting this Christmas, but her phone remained silent, each unanswered message a reminder of how time and distance had stretched her family apart. With a sigh, she made her way up the driveway, her boots crunching in the snow. As she fumbled with her keys at the front door, a flash of movement across the street caught her attention. Turning, she saw a young girl, no more than 8 years old, standing by her neighbor's trash bin. The child's thin pink dress clung to her small frame, clearly inadequate for the biting cold. Her dark braids swayed in the wind, and her eyes darted around, full of caution and hunger. Agnes felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the weather. Why was a child out here alone? And why was she rummaging through a trash bin on Christmas Eve? The girl reached into the bin, her movements swift and furtive, as if she feared being caught. After a moment, she pulled out a black plastic bag, holding it tightly against her chest. Agnes felt a surge of worry as she watched the girl hurry down the street, clutching her prize like a lifeline. The sight unsettled her deeply. Here, in the warmth and security of their suburban neighborhood, a young child was digging through trash for survival. Agnes shook her head, trying to clear her mind. She had groceries to put away and a house to prepare. She couldn't just stand outside in the cold worrying about a stranger. But as she stepped inside and placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, her mind kept drifting back to the girl. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what was her story? These questions lingered as Agnes began to unpack her groceries. She tried to brush off the concern, focusing instead on the family dinner she planned to prepare, just in case her children decided to surprise her. The holiday season was about hope, after all, and even if she ended up alone, she would still carry on the traditions that had always brought her comfort. As she unpacked the last of her groceries, Agnes noticed a folded piece of paper mixed in with her mail. It was simple, without any address or stamp, and didn't appear to be part of the usual assortment of holiday cards and bills. Curious, she unfolded it. Inside, there was a brief, hastily scrawled message. "Please help me. I don't know what to do." The cryptic note sent a chill down her spine. She looked around, half expecting someone to knock on the door or appear in her yard. But the street was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of Christmas music playing from her neighbor's open window. Agnes felt a strange unease settle over her, like a shadow creeping into her usually safe, familiar world. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. "Rowan," she called out, her voice carrying through the house. Her husband, Rowan, shuffled in from the living room, where he'd been half watching a football game. He was a sturdy man, with a gentle face softened by age, and he gave her a warm, if slightly distracted, smile. "What's wrong, Agnes?" he asked, noticing the troubled look in her eyes. "Have you seen a young girl around the neighborhood today?" Agnes asked, her tone hesitant yet determined. She was by the trash bin across the street, and she looked like she needed help. Rowan frowned, scratching his head. "No, can't say that I have. It's Christmas Eve. Agnes, maybe she just got lost." Agnes shook her head, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the note she'd found. "I don't think so, Rowan." She was digging through the trash, and she looked so cold. "And I found this note." She held up the paper, her expression filled with worry. "Someone left it with our mail." Rowan took the note, glancing at the hastily written message before handing it back. He shrugged, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Probably just some prank, Agnes. You know how kids can be." "But what if it's not?" Agnes replied, a hint of irritation creeping into her voice. "What if she's in trouble?" "She's just a child, Rowan." Rowan sighed, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Look, if it'll make you feel better, I'll keep an eye out. But don't let it ruin your Christmas, all right? We have dinner to get ready." Agnes nodded, though she could tell Rowan didn't share her sense of urgency. She knew him well enough to understand that he didn't like complications, especially when they interrupted his carefully planned routines. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the girl needed help. As she returned to the kitchen, Agnes continued preparing the meal, but her thoughts were miles away. She kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see the girl again. The smell of roasted ham and spices began to fill the air, a comforting aroma that usually brought her peace. But today, it felt hollow, as if something vital was missing. Just as she was setting the table, a soft knock echoed through the house. Agnes's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Rowan, who raised an eyebrow but didn't move from his armchair. "I'll get it," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She made her way to the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Could it be the girl? Or maybe one of her children, surprising her with a holiday visit? Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Standing on the porch was the same young girl, shivering in the thin pink dress. Her eyes were wide with fear and desperation, her hands clutching her stomach. Up close, Agnes could see the exhaustion etched into her small face, the way her lips trembled from the cold. Her belly protruded in a way that didn't seem natural, a sight that filled Agnes with dread. "Oh, honey," Agnes said softly, her heart breaking at the sight. "Come inside. You'll freeze out here." The girl hesitated, glancing behind her as if she feared being followed. Then, slowly, she stepped over the threshold, her tiny body quivering as she took in the warmth and light of Agnes's home. Agnes guided her to the living room, wrapping a soft blanket around her shoulders. Rowan watched them with mild curiosity, but said nothing, sensing the gravity of the moment. "What's your name?" Agnes asked gently, kneeling beside the girl. The child looked down, her fingers fiddling with a loose thread on the blanket. "Jasmine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Agnes smiled, trying to ease the girl's tension. "That's a beautiful name, Jasmine. I'm Agnes, and this is my husband, Rowan. You're safe here, okay?" The girl nodded, but her eyes remained haunted, darting around as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Agnes felt a surge of protectiveness well up inside her. Whatever had brought Jasmine here, she was determined to find out, and to help, no matter what it took. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the warmth of Agnes's home began to thaw the frost of fear clinging to Jasmine. Yet, Agnes knew the night was far from over. She had stumbled upon a mystery, one that would turn this Christmas Eve into a night she would never forget. Unraveling secrets. Agnes watched Jasmine closely as the girl sank into the plush armchair, clutching the blanket like a shield. Her small frame seemed swallowed by the oversized furniture, yet her presence filled the room with an unsettling tension. Agnes took a seat across from her, her heart aching at the sight of the child's thin, trembling hands and her hollowed eyes, which darted around the room, lingering on the shadows as though wary of what they concealed. "Would you like something warm to drink, Jasmine?" Agnes asked gently, trying to bring some comfort to the nervous child. "Maybe some hot cocoa." Jasmine hesitated, her eyes searching Agnes's face for any sign of a hidden threat. Finally, she gave a timid nod. Agnes offered a reassuring smile before heading to the kitchen. As she prepared the hot cocoa, adding a generous swirl of whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon, she couldn't shake the unease in her heart. The note, the girl's fearful demeanor, her distended belly. Everything pointed to a story far more troubling than she could have imagined. When Agnes returned, she found Rowan in the room, standing a few feet away from Jasmine, who was now leaning back, her eyes closed as if she could finally let her guard down, if only for a moment. Rowan looked at Agnes, his expression softening in a way that told her he, too, sensed the child's vulnerability. "Here you go, sweetie," Agnes said, offering the mug to Jasmine. "Careful, it's hot." Jasmine opened her eyes and took the cup with both hands, cradling it like a precious treasure. She took a small sip, her lips curving into a faint smile as the warmth spread through her. Agnes felt a pang of relief, but knew this moment of calm would be brief. The girl had come here for a reason, and Agnes needed to understand why. "So, Jasmine," Agnes began, her tone gentle but firm, "can you tell us why you were out there alone tonight? It's far too cold for you to be wandering around without a coat." Jasmine's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers tightening around the mug. She seemed to shrink, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. I didn't mean to bother you, ma'am," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I just didn't have anywhere else to go." Agnes's heart clenched. "But where is your family, honey? Do you live around here?" The girl shook her head, her braids brushing against her cheeks. "I don't have a family. Not anymore." The room fell silent. Agnes exchanged a worried glance with Rowan, who looked as lost as she felt. She reached out and gently placed her hand over Jasmine's, hoping the touch would offer some comfort. "I'm so sorry, Jasmine. I can't imagine how hard that must be," Agnes said softly. "But there must be someone looking out for you, right? Maybe a guardian or a relative." Jasmine shook her head again, her eyes filling with tears. "There was someone, but he hurt me. So I ran away." Agnes's breath caught. She felt a surge of anger and sorrow, tempered only by the need to keep her composure. Her hand tightened on Jasmine's, and she took a deep, calming breath. "You're safe here," she promised. "Nobody will hurt you in this house." The girl's shoulders slumped, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over her. She took another sip of cocoa, her eyes drifting to the flickering Christmas lights outside the window. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" Agnes asked, glancing at Rowan, who gave a slight nod, silently offering his support. "We have dinner ready, and you're welcome to join us." Jasmine nodded, her face lighting up slightly at the mention of food. Agnes led her to the kitchen, where she set a place for the girl at the table. Jasmine's eyes widened at the sight of the roasted ham, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce, a traditional Christmas feast, though likely far more than she had seen in a long time. As they ate, Jasmine's appetite slowly grew, and she began to take larger bites, as though she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Agnes watched her with a mixture of sadness and admiration, impressed by the resilience it must have taken for the child to survive alone in the world. After dinner, Rowan retired to the living room, leaving Agnes and Jasmine to clean up. As they washed dishes side by side, Agnes felt the urge to probe deeper, but she knew she had to tread carefully. The girl had been through enough, and Agnes didn't want to overwhelm her. Instead, she decided to share a little bit about herself, hoping it might encourage Jasmine to open up. "You know," she began, drying a plate with a dish towel, "I remember spending Christmas Eve with my family when I was about your age. My mother would bake gingerbread cookies, and my father would read us stories by the fireplace. Those were some of the best memories of my life." Jasmine looked up, her eyes filled with a wistful longing. "I don't remember Christmases like that," she said softly. "For as long as I can remember, it's just been me and—" She trailed off, a shadow crossing her face. Agnes reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. But just know that whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone." Jasmine's lip trembled, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might start crying. But she swallowed hard, blinking back the tears. "Thank you, Ms. Agnes," she whispered. "You're the first person who's ever been this kind to me." Agnes's heart swelled with compassion. "You deserve kindness, Jasmine. Everyone does." As they finished up in the kitchen, Agnes noticed that Jasmine was starting to relax, her posture less guarded, her movements more at ease. She guided the girl to the guest room, which she decorated with soft bedding and a small Christmas wreath above the bed. "You can sleep here tonight," Agnes said, tucking the blankets around Jasmine as though she were tucking in one of her own grandchildren. But just as Agnes was about to leave, she felt a tug on her sleeve. She turned to see Jasmine's wide, pleading eyes staring up at her. "Miss Agnes, would you stay with me, just until I fall asleep?" Agnes smiled, her heart melting. "Of course, dear." She sat on the edge of the bed, stroking Jasmine's hair and humming a soft lullaby. Slowly, the girl's breathing steadied, and her eyes fluttered shut. But just as Agnes thought she'd drifted off, Jasmine whispered something that sent a chill down her spine. "He'll come looking for me," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. "He always does." Agnes's heart stopped, her mind racing with questions. But before she could ask Jasmine to explain, the girl had fallen asleep, her expression peaceful, as though the shadows in her life had been momentarily banished. Agnes sat beside her for a while longer, lost in thought. Who was this man that Jasmine feared? And what kind of life had she endured to make her believe she had nowhere else to turn? As the clock struck midnight, Agnes made a silent vow. She didn't know the full story, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Jasmine had come to her for a reason. And no matter what, Agnes would do everything in her power to protect her. Little did she know, however, that Jasmine's troubles were far from over. The danger that haunted her was closer than Agnes could have ever imagined, lurking just beyond the glow of the Christmas lights, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Shadows in the night. Agnes woke abruptly to the sound of a soft, persistent tapping. She lay still, blinking in the darkness, listening. It was late, the kind of silence that only comes in the dead of night, when the world is fast asleep. But that tapping, gentle and repetitive, echoed down the quiet hallway, growing louder in her ears. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding. For a moment, she wondered if it was Rowan, perhaps up for a drink of water or restless from too much Christmas dinner. But then she remembered the look in Jasmine's eyes as she whispered, "He'll come looking for me. He always does." Shaking off the remnants of sleep, Agnes slipped quietly out of bed, grabbing her robe to ward off the December chill. She made her way down the hall, past the door of the guest room where Jasmine slept. Peeking in, she was relieved to see the girl still curled up under the blankets, breathing softly. The sight calmed Agnes's nerves, if only for a moment. The tapping continued. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was at the front door. Agnes's mind raced. Who could possibly be out there at this hour? She felt a chill of unease settle over her, reminding her of the mysterious note she'd found with her mail that morning. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the door and peered through the peephole. In the dim porch light, she saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond the door, barely distinguishable in the darkness. The figure was tall and stocky, bundled in a heavy coat with a hood pulled low over their face. Her stomach clenched, but she willed herself to stay calm. Whoever it was, they hadn't made a move to leave, nor had they done anything more aggressive than knock. "Who is it?" she called through the door, her voice steadier than she felt. There was a pause, and then a low, rough voice answered. "Ma'am, I'm looking for my daughter." Agnes's heart skipped a beat. Her hand instinctively went to her throat as she glanced back down the hallway toward Jasmine's room. She felt a surge of protective instinct rise within her. "There's no one here but my family," Agnes replied, choosing her words carefully. "I think you might have the wrong house." The man's voice hardened. "I know she's here. A little girl, dark hair, pink dress. She came in through your door earlier this evening. I just need to talk to her, Mom." A chill ran through Agnes, her mind racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. Jasmine's words echoed in her memory. "He always does." Agnes's fingers tightened on the doorframe, her heart pounding. She could feel an unshakable sense of dread creeping over her. Jasmine had come here for help, to escape from this man. Agnes spoke with newfound resolve. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no little girl here. You must be mistaken." She took a step back, signaling with her body language that the conversation was over. The man's response was an uncomfortable silence. After a tense moment, he took a step forward, casting his face into the dim glow of the porch light. Agnes could make out the dark lines of his features, a rough stubble along his jaw, and piercing, restless eyes that seemed to burn with anger or desperation. His voice softened, as if attempting to cajole her. "Listen, ma'am, I know you're just trying to help. But Jasmine, she's my daughter. She belongs with me." Agnes felt a rush of anger mixed with fear. Her instincts screamed that something was horribly wrong with this man. She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know any Jasmine," she replied, her voice sharper. "Please leave." The man's expression hardened, and for a moment, Agnes thought he might force his way inside. But then, almost reluctantly, he took a step back. His eyes bore into hers, and his lips twisted into a sneer. "Fine, ma'am. But don't think I'll give up that easily. She belongs with me, whether you like it or not." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps fading as he walked back down the driveway. Agnes watched him go, her body taut with tension, until she was certain he was gone. Only then did she release a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her racing heart. Quietly, she locked the door and made her way back to Jasmine's room. The girl was still asleep, her small body curled under the covers, her expression peaceful. Agnes felt a surge of protectiveness as she watched her, a fierce determination that surprised her. She had only known Jasmine for a few hours, but something inside her refused to let the girl go back to that man, not if he was who she feared he was. As Agnes turned to leave, Jasmine stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at Agnes with a sleepy, confused expression. "Ms. Agnes," she whispered, her voice drowsy. Agnes sat beside her, smoothing a hand over her hair. "It's all right, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Jasmine didn't close her eyes. Instead, she reached out and clutched Agnes's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Did he find me?" Agnes hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but he's gone now. You're safe." A shadow crossed Jasmine's face, and she shivered, drawing the blanket tighter around her. He always finds me. No matter where I go, he finds me." Agnes felt a pang of sadness mixed with anger. She leaned closer, her voice firm. "Jasmine, listen to me. You don't have to be afraid. I'll keep you safe. He won't hurt you anymore." Jasmine looked at her, searching her face as if trying to believe her words. After a moment, she nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. Agnes knew it would take more than words to convince her. As Jasmine drifted back to sleep, Agnes sat in the room, watching over her like a silent guardian. She knew that the man would return. His determination had been evident in his words, in the dark, piercing look he had given her before disappearing into the night. And if he came back, she needed a plan to keep Jasmine safe. By dawn, Agnes had made up her mind. She wouldn't wait for the man to come back. She needed to understand more about who he was and what Jasmine had been through. She needed to find answers. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, Agnes called a close friend, Eleanor, who volunteered with local shelters and foster programs. Eleanor was known for her connections and had a knack for unearthing information that would otherwise go unnoticed. If anyone could help her figure out more about Jasmine's past, it was Eleanor. Within an hour, Eleanor arrived, a short, energetic woman with a warm smile and a determined gleam in her eye. Agnes explained the situation in a hushed voice, careful to keep Jasmine from overhearing. "She showed up last night, Eleanor," Agnes said, her voice filled with worry. "She's scared out of her mind. And there was a man outside my door. He called himself her father, but I could tell. Something's not right." Eleanor frowned, her face tightening. "Agnes, you might be onto something serious here. If that man is who I think he is, then Jasmine could be in real danger." She glanced at the girl, who was watching television with Rowan in the next room. She looked so small, so vulnerable. Agnes nodded, her hands twisting together in her lap. "Please, Eleanor, help me find out who he is. And if there's anything I can do to protect her legally, I want to know." Eleanor placed a comforting hand on Agnes's shoulder. "I'll make some calls, and in the meantime, keep an eye on her. Don't let her out of your sight." Agnes nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and fear. As Eleanor left, promising to get back to her with any information, Agnes returned to the living room, where Jasmine was watching a cartoon. She sat down beside her, offering her a gentle smile. "Jasmine, how about we spend the day together? Maybe make some cookies. I could use a helper." Jasmine's face lit up, and for a moment, her fears seemed to melt away. She gave a small nod, her smile timid but genuine. "I'd like that, Ms. Agnes." They spent the morning baking gingerbread cookies, with Jasmine laughing as Agnes showed her how to decorate them with icing and sprinkles. For a few hours, it felt as if the darkness surrounding them had lifted, replaced by the simple joy of a child who, despite everything, still had the capacity to smile. But in the back of her mind, Agnes couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. She knew the man would be back, and she would be ready. She didn't know how or when, but she would keep her promise to Jasmine, no matter what it took. Beneath the surface, the day slipped by in a blur of laughter, baking, and the warmth of shared company. Agnes found herself captivated by Jasmine's bright spirit. Beneath the fear and fragility, there was a spark of joy that hadn't been entirely extinguished, and it filled Agnes's heart with a fierce, protective determination. She wanted to keep that spark alive, to shield Jasmine from the shadows that had chased her here. By evening, however, Agnes's worries had begun to resurface. The encounter with the man at her door weighed heavily on her mind. She had no doubt he would return, perhaps more determined than before. And as night fell, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows, waiting. Just after they finished dinner, Agnes's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw Eleanor's name flashing, her heart jumping with both relief and trepidation. She excused herself and went to the kitchen, her voice low as she answered. "Eleanor." "I found something," Eleanor replied, her tone serious. "I spent the day making calls and digging through files. Agnes, I think Jasmine's in more trouble than we thought." Agnes's grip on the phone tightened. "What did you find?" There was a pause on the line, then Eleanor spoke carefully. "There's a man named Darrell Royce who's been under investigation for suspected child neglect and abuse. He's been on the radar for a while now, but authorities haven't had enough evidence to make a case. He moves frequently, and every time they get close, he disappears. If Jasmine is who I think she is, then she's probably one of his wards." Agnes felt a cold fury rise within her, mingling with a sick dread. "Wards." She repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He's known to take in vulnerable children under the guise of being their guardian or caretaker, but there's nothing legal about it. He targets children without families, kids who won't be missed. And, well, let's just say he doesn't have their best interests at heart." Agnes's hand trembled as she clutched the phone. "But how has he gotten away with it for so long?" Eleanor sighed. "It's a sad truth, Agnes. These children fall through the cracks. They're often from broken homes, or their guardians can't look after them properly. People like Darrell Royce know how to exploit that. They're manipulative, resourceful, and hard to pin down legally. He has a way of intimidating or scaring his wards into silence." Agnes's stomach churned as she thought of the fear in Jasmine's eyes, her words from last night. "He always finds me. Is there anything I can do?" Agnes whispered, a desperation creeping into her voice. Eleanor's tone softened. "Agnes, I know this is difficult, but if Jasmine wants to stay with you, you can provide her with a safe haven while I work with a few contacts. Legally, it's complicated, but if we can gather enough evidence of her being in danger, we might be able to help." Agnes nodded, determination hardening her resolve. "Thank you, Eleanor. Please, keep digging. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her." After she hung up, Agnes leaned against the kitchen counter, her mind racing. The situation was even darker than she had anticipated. Darryl Royce was no ordinary man looking for a runaway child. He was a predator, someone who saw children as possessions, tools for his own twisted purposes. Jasmine was not safe as long as he was out there. Taking a deep breath, she returned to the living room, where Jasmine sat with Rowan, who was quietly watching an old Christmas movie. Jasmine looked up, her eyes filled with a tentative hope. Agnes took a seat beside her, choosing her words carefully. "Jasmine, honey, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you know a man named Darryl?" Jasmine's face went pale, and she quickly looked away, clutching her hands in her lap. Her small body tensed, as if bracing for a blow. "It's okay, Jasmine," Agnes said softly, reaching out to gently touch her hand. "You're safe here, but I need to know so I can help you. Is Darryl the man who was at the door last night?" Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes, and she nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. Agnes's heart ached as she saw the battle in the child's gaze, the way she seemed caught between fear and an overwhelming need to trust. Agnes took a steadying breath, her voice soft and full of warmth. "You don't have to tell me everything if you're not ready, Jasmine. But know that whatever he's done, whatever he's made you feel, it's not your fault. And he's not going to hurt you here, I promise." Jasmine sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. He says he's my dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But he's not. Not really. I don't remember my real parents. He took me in, but it was never right. He'd get angry if I didn't do what he wanted, and if I tried to leave, he'd find me and make it worse." Agnes swallowed the lump in her throat, doing her best to keep her emotions in check. She didn't want to frighten Jasmine with the anger bubbling inside her. "You don't have to worry about him anymore, sweetheart. You're safe here, and I'll make sure of it." Jasmine nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. Agnes helped her settle in for the night, tucking her into the guest bed and watching over her until she drifted off to sleep. But Agnes didn't sleep. She spent the night keeping vigil by the window, every creak of the house sending her nerves on edge. Her thoughts raced, formulating plans and praying Eleanor would find a way to keep Darryl Royce out of Jasmine's life forever. The following day, Agnes took Jasmine into town to buy her some warmer clothes. Jasmine's eyes lit up as they wandered through the store, marveling at the racks of coats, sweaters, and winter accessories. For a brief moment, she seemed like any other child, free to explore and express herself. Agnes let her pick out a coat, a deep burgundy color with a fur-lined hood that made her eyes shine. Jasmine beamed as she tried it on, twirling to show it off. Agnes smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. She knew these moments were only small comforts in the grand scheme of Jasmine's struggles, but every small step was a victory. After shopping, they stopped at a small cafe for lunch. Jasmine sat across from Agnes, sipping a warm mug of hot chocolate, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked almost carefree. But as they walked back to the car, Agnes spotted a figure in the distance, watching them from across the street. Her breath caught as she recognized the man from last night, Darryl. His eyes were locked on Jasmine, his face twisted in a look of barely concealed fury. Agnes's first instinct was to shield Jasmine, to wrap her arms around her and run. But she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that panic would only frighten the child. She held Jasmine's hand tightly, her voice steady. "Jasmine, let's go back to the car. All right. Quickly. Now." Jasmine glanced up, her eyes widening as she caught sight of Darryl. Fear flashed across her face, and she gripped Agnes's hand even tighter. They'd made their way to the car, and Agnes helped Jasmine inside before sliding into the driver's seat. She kept her eyes on Darryl as she started the engine, her heart racing as he took a few steps toward them. Agnes didn't hesitate. She pulled out of the parking lot, watching Daryl's figure grow smaller in the rearview mirror, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud, filling her with a gnawing sense of dread. She knew this wasn't over. Daryl wouldn't give up so easily. When they arrived home, Agnes called Eleanor again, explaining what had happened. "Agnes," Eleanor's voice was tense. "This man is dangerous. If he's watching you in public, he's escalating. You need to report this to the police. They can start a file on him and help monitor the situation. It's not a permanent solution, but it's a step." Agnes nodded, feeling both helpless and determined. "I'll do it, but I'm not letting him get anywhere near Jasmine." After she hung up, Agnes sat beside Jasmine on the couch, pulling her into a comforting hug. Jasmine snuggled close, resting her head on Agnes's shoulder, her small frame finally relaxing. That night, Agnes took extra precautions, double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, even setting up a chair by the front door so she could hear if anyone tried to enter. She wasn't taking any chances. If Daryl tried to come after Jasmine again, he would have to go through her first. As the clock ticked into the early hours of morning, Agnes sat in the quiet house, watching over Jasmine, her heart filled with both fear and fierce determination. Daryl Royce was a man who thrived on control, a predator who preyed on the vulnerable. But he had underestimated the power of love, the strength of a woman who had made up her mind to protect a child in need. Agnes didn't know how this battle would end, but she knew one thing with unwavering certainty. As long as she had breath in her body, she would fight to keep Jasmine safe. The shadows that haunted the child would have to face a light stronger than they could ever anticipate. The confrontation. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the weight of the previous night lingering like a shadow over Agnes's heart. She had barely slept, her mind alert to every sound, every creak of the house. The confrontation with Daryl at the cafe replayed over and over in her mind, stoking her fears and hardening her resolve. She knew now that simply hiding Jasmine wasn't enough. Daryl was relentless, and she could see he was growing bolder. If she didn't find a way to protect Jasmine permanently, this nightmare would continue. After breakfast, Agnes drove Jasmine to the local police station. She didn't want to frighten the girl, so she framed the visit as a necessary step to ensure her safety. Jasmine looked small and nervous as they entered the station, her wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Agnes took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze as they approached the front desk. A young officer with a kind face greeted them, his brow furrowing as Agnes explained the situation. "I'd like to file a report about a man who has been stalking this child," she said, her voice firm and calm. "His name is Daryl Royce. He's not her father, though he claims to be, and I believe he poses a serious threat." The officer nodded, motioning for them to follow him into a private room where they could speak more freely. Once they were seated, he asked Agnes to recount everything from the moment Jasmine had arrived on her doorstep. Agnes spared no detail, recounting each of Daryl's attempts to find Jasmine, his appearance on her porch, and the encounter at the cafe. She felt a sense of relief as she shared her fears with someone who could help. The officer listened intently, jotting down notes. When Agnes finished, he turned to Jasmine, his voice gentle. "Jasmine, I know this might be difficult to talk about, but can you tell me anything you remember about Daryl? Anything he's done to make you feel unsafe?" Jasmine's face grew pale, and she glanced at Agnes, as if seeking permission to speak. Agnes gave her a small nod, silently encouraging her to be brave. Jasmine swallowed, her voice trembling as she began. He's mean," she whispered, her small hands twisting in her lap. "He says he's my dad, but he's not. He yells a lot. Sometimes he hurts me if I don't do what he says, and if I ever try to run, he always finds me." Agnes felt a surge of anger and protectiveness as she watched Jasmine struggle to find the words. She wished she could take away the girl's pain, erase the scars that fear had left behind. The officer's expression grew serious, and he nodded, offering Jasmine a reassuring smile. "Thank you for telling me that, Jasmine. I know it's not easy to talk about." He turned back to Agnes. "We'll open a file on Mr. Royce and alert our patrol officers to keep an eye on your house. If he shows up again, don't hesitate to call us. And if things escalate, we'll take further action." Agnes nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. The officers were sympathetic, but she sensed that without concrete evidence, their hands were tied. Darrell Royce was clever. He knew how to manipulate the system, to stay just within the boundaries of the law. But at least they had taken the first step. And with the police on alert, she hoped it would be enough to keep him at bay. After leaving the station, Agnes took Jasmine for a small treat at the local bakery, hoping to lift her spirits. They shared a warm cinnamon bun, the sweet aroma filling the air as they sat in a cozy corner booth. Jasmine's mood brightened, her eyes lighting up as she licked the sticky icing from her fingers. Agnes smiled, grateful for these small moments of joy that allowed Jasmine to just be a child again, even if only for a little while. But as they drove home, Agnes's unease returned. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Darrell's face behind them. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her, a constant reminder that Jasmine's safety was in her hands. Back at the house, Agnes settled Jasmine in with a warm blanket and a movie, hoping the comforting familiarity of the home would help her relax. But Agnes couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house made her nerves stand on edge. She kept the curtains closed, checking the locks on the doors and windows, preparing herself for whatever might come. That evening, as they were finishing dinner, there was a loud, insistent knock at the door. Agnes's heart lurched, and she exchanged a worried glance with Jasmine, who froze, her eyes widening in terror. "Stay here," Agnes whispered, her voice calm but firm. She took a deep breath, steeling herself as she walked toward the front door. Peering through the peephole, she saw him. Darrell Royce, standing on her porch, his hands jammed into his coat pockets, his face shadowed but unmistakable. Agnes's heart pounded, but she squared her shoulders, refusing to let him see her fear. She opened the door just enough to face him, keeping her voice steady. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone cold and unyielding. Darrell's face twisted into a smug grin, his eyes gleaming with a predatory glint. "I want my daughter back," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can hide her from me, but you're wrong. She's mine, and I won't stop until she's back with me." Agnes's hands tightened on the door, her anger rising. "She's not your daughter, Darrell, and she's not going anywhere with you. I know what kind of man you are." Darrell's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, old woman. You think you can keep her safe. She's a little runaway. You think anyone cares what happens to her. She's better off with me." Agnes felt a surge of fury at his callous words, her voice rising as she answered. "I do care, Darrell, and I will do everything in my power to keep her away from you. Now, leave before I call the police." Darrell's face contorted with rage, and for a moment, Agnes feared he might force his way inside. But then he took a step back, his sneer returning as he jabbed a finger at her. "You haven't seen the last of me," he growled. "This isn't over." He turned and stormed off, his footsteps echoing down the driveway. Agnes watched him go, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. She locked the door and leaned against it, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She had stood her ground, but she knew this confrontation would not be the end. When she returned to the living room, she found Jasmine curled up on the couch, her small body trembling with fear. Agnes wrapped her arms around the girl, pulling her close. "It's okay, sweetheart. He's gone," she whispered, stroking Jasmine's hair as she rocked her gently. "You're safe here." Jasmine looked up at her, tears pooling in her eyes. "Will he come back?" Agnes's heart ached, but she forced herself to smile, her voice filled with conviction. "If he does, he'll find me waiting. I won't let him take you, Jasmine. I promise." That night, Agnes decided to take drastic measures. She called Eleanor, explaining the confrontation and Darrell's threats. Eleanor, we need to do something. I can't keep living in fear, waiting for him to show up again. Eleanor's voice was grave. Agnes, I agree. I have a friend in Child Protective Services. I'll reach out and see if there's a way to expedite a legal process that would give you temporary custody. If we can prove that she's in danger, we might be able to keep him away legally. Agnes felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Eleanor. I'll do whatever it takes. For the next few days, Agnes and Jasmine stayed close to the house, maintaining a low profile while Eleanor worked behind the scenes. Every sound outside, every shadow that moved across the yard, kept Agnes on edge. She knew Daryl was out there, watching, waiting for an opportunity, but she was determined not to give him one. Finally, on Christmas Eve, Agnes received a call from Eleanor. Agnes, we've done it. Child Protective Services has granted you temporary guardianship of Jasmine. It's not a permanent solution, but it gives us legal grounds to keep Daryl away. And if he violates the terms, the police will have more authority to act. Agnes's heart lifted. A weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying finally lifting. Thank you, Eleanor. I don't know how to repay you. Eleanor's voice softened. Just keep her safe, Agnes. That's all the repayment I need. That night, Agnes and Jasmine decorated a small Christmas tree, hanging ornaments and stringing lights, while Christmas music played softly in the background. For the first time since Jasmine had come into her life, Agnes felt a sense of peace, a quiet confidence that they had finally turned a corner. As they hung the last ornament, Jasmine looked up at Agnes, a shy smile on her face. Thank you, Miss Agnes, she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. For everything. Agnes knelt down, pulling the girl into a warm hug. You're welcome, Jasmine, and Merry Christmas, my sweet girl. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, peaceful silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, Agnes felt truly safe. She knew that the journey was far from over, that there would still be challenges ahead. But with Jasmine by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. And as they sat by the glow of the Christmas tree, Agnes made a silent vow. Jasmine had found her way to her doorstep by chance, but Agnes would ensure that she would never be alone or afraid again. She had gained a new family, a new purpose, and as the snow continued to fall, she knew that this was the beginning of a brighter, safer life for them both. A new dawn. Christmas morning arrived quietly, with a blanket of fresh snow covering the ground, muffling the sounds of the neighborhood. The soft, gray light filtered through the curtains as Agnes stirred, her heart lighter than it had felt in days. She glanced over at the small guest bed where Jasmine lay, curled up peacefully under layers of quilts. The girl's face was serene, her breath soft and even. For the first time since she had arrived, Jasmine looked truly at peace, her guard finally down. Agnes rose quietly, careful not to wake her, and padded into the kitchen to start breakfast. She wanted to make this Christmas morning special, something Jasmine would remember for years to come. As she stirred the pancake batter and brewed coffee, she felt a deep sense of purpose settle within her. Jasmine's arrival had transformed her home, and in many ways, her life. Agnes had been living a quiet existence, burdened by an unspoken loneliness that she'd barely acknowledged. But now, with Jasmine here, everything felt vibrant and meaningful. As she set the table with plates and cups, she heard the soft padding of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Jasmine standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the smell of pancakes and the soft glow of the small Christmas tree Agnes had decorated the night before. Merry Christmas, Jasmine. Agnes greeted her warmly, smiling as she waved her over to the table. Jasmine's face broke into a shy smile, and she shuffled over to the table, her eyes bright with excitement. Merry Christmas, Miss Agnes. They sat down to breakfast together, enjoying the simple meal as the house filled with warmth. Agnes could feel the bond between them growing stronger, The unspoken promise she'd made to keep Jasmine safe deepening with every shared glance and quiet laugh. After breakfast, they moved to the small pile of gifts Agnes had placed under the tree. She had only been able to pick up a few things for Jasmine, but she had chosen each one carefully. A warm winter coat, a set of coloring supplies, and a small book of bedtime stories. Each gift was practical, but it was also a symbol of her commitment to Jasmine's well-being. Jasmine's eyes widened with surprise as she opened each present, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Agnes felt a pang of sadness, wondering how long it had been since Jasmine had experienced a Christmas morning like this. She could see the girl was unaccustomed to kindness, to having someone think about her and her needs. This is too much," Jasmine whispered, her voice choked with emotion as she clutched the book to her chest. No one's ever given me all this before." Agnes reached over, placing a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "You deserve every bit of it, Jasmine. You deserve to feel safe, loved, and cared for." Jasmine's lip trembled, and she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around Agnes in a tight hug. Agnes held her close, feeling the warmth of the girl's small frame, the weight of her trust settling into her heart. It was a trust she would protect with everything she had. They spent the rest of the day together, reading stories from Jasmine's new book and coloring side by side at the kitchen table. Agnes marveled at the ease with which they shared their time, the quiet comfort of simply being together. Jasmine's laughter filled the house, lifting the shadows that had once lingered in every corner. Agnes found herself wondering how she had ever managed without this small, fierce soul in her life. As afternoon turned to evening, the doorbell rang unexpectedly, startling both of them. Agnes's heart skipped a beat, her mind immediately jumping to Daryl. She stood, signaling to Jasmine to stay where she was, and made her way to the front door, her body tense. Peering through the peephole, she saw a familiar face. Officer Miller, the kind policeman from the station who had helped them file the report. Agnes breathed a sigh of relief and opened the door, offering him a cautious smile. "Good evening, Officer Miller," she greeted him, her voice calm but curious. "What brings you here on Christmas?" The officer tipped his hat, his expression kind but serious. "Good evening, Ms. Miller. I wanted to check in with you about Daryl Royce. I know the holidays can make things difficult, and I wanted to be sure you and Jasmine are all right." Agnes nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you. We're doing well. I appreciate you checking in on us." Officer Miller glanced behind him, then back at Agnes, lowering his voice. "We've been keeping an eye on Royce. He was spotted near the edge of town this morning, but when we tried to approach him, he disappeared. We have a few officers stationed in the area in case he tries anything. But I wanted to personally let you know that we're doing everything we can to keep him away from Jasmine." Agnes's heart tightened, a mixture of relief and anxiety washing over her. She nodded, her hand instinctively going to her chest. "Thank you, officer. I can't tell you how much that means to us." He offered a reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. Just know that we're on your side. And if anything happens, don't hesitate to call." As he turned to leave, Agnes felt a wave of gratitude that left her feeling both relieved and emotional. Knowing that the police were keeping a close eye on Daryl gave her a renewed sense of hope. She closed the door, her heart lighter as she returned to the living room, where Jasmine sat, looking up at her expectantly. "It was Officer Miller," she explained, sitting down beside Jasmine. "He just wanted to make sure we're safe and let us know they're keeping an eye on things." Jasmine nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I like him. He's nice." Agnes smiled, ruffling Jasmine's hair. "Yes, he is." The rest of the evening passed in quiet contentment. As night fell, they curled up on the couch together, wrapped in warm blankets as they watched an old Christmas movie. The soft glow of the tree lights bathed the room in a peaceful glow, and Agnes felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for this moment, this fragile but beautiful piece they had created together. Just as the credits began to roll, Jasmine turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "Ms. Agnes," she said softly, "I don't want to ever go back. Not ever. I don't want to be scared anymore." Agnes felt a lump form in her throat. She reached over, taking Jasmine's hand in her own. "You won't have to, Jasmine. I promise you that. As long as I'm here, you'll never have to go back. You'll always have a home with me." Jasmine looked at her with a hopeful, tear-filled gaze. Even if they say I have to." Agnes's heart ached at the question. She knew the legal battle ahead could be complicated, but she was willing to fight it with every ounce of strength she had. "Even if they say you have to, I'll fight for you, Jasmine. I'll do whatever it takes." A soft smile spread across Jasmine's face, and she nodded, her expression finally free of the shadow of fear. They sat together in silence, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, the room filled with a sense of quiet victory. Later that night, as Agnes tucked Jasmine into bed, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She watched the girl drift off to sleep, her face soft and serene, and felt a surge of hope for the future. Agnes knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew she was ready for it. She was no longer alone, and neither was Jasmine. The next morning, she reached out to Eleanor and arranged to start the official paperwork to make Jasmine's stay permanent. Together, they would navigate the legal system, working to ensure that Jasmine would never have to live in fear again. Agnes would see to it that Jasmine had the stability, love, and safety she deserved, no matter how long it took. As days turned into weeks, Daryl Royce's presence began to fade. The police continued to monitor the area, and eventually they found evidence that he had left town altogether. It was a relief, but Agnes remained vigilant, her resolve unshaken. She had become Jasmine's protector, her safe haven, and nothing would change that. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The snow melted and flowers began to bloom in Agnes's garden, a testament to the growth and healing that had taken root within her home. Jasmine had blossomed too, shedding her fear little by little, her laughter filling the house with light and joy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jasmine reached over, taking Agnes's hand in her own. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion, "for everything." Agnes squeezed her hand, smiling as she looked into Jasmine's grateful, hopeful eyes. "You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. You're family now, and family takes care of each other." As they sat together, watching the stars appear in the sky, Agnes felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had found a purpose, a calling that had filled her life with meaning. And Jasmine, the little girl who had knocked on her door one cold Christmas Eve, had given her a reason to keep fighting, to keep hoping. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, hand in hand, their hearts bound by the unbreakable bond they had forged in the warmth of Agnes's home. And as the first fireflies of spring blinked to life around them, Agnes knew that, for the first time in a long time, everything was going to be all right.